Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Launching a First Product in Europe, the Supply Chain Perspective, presented by AIM. I'm your host, Michael Shashua. Our moderator today is Pim van der Aar, co-founder and managing director at AIM, and he will introduce the panelists for the hour. You can read the panelists' full bios on the left side of your window by selecting the Speakers tab. Just a few technical notes before we begin. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. Time permitting, we will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Questions and Answers tab on the left side of your screen. All right, we're ready to begin. Pim, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. Welcome on behalf of AIM. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce you to our first AIM Fierce Pharma webinar. Talking today about launching your first product in Europe, and we will look at this through our supply chain lenses. A few opening statements before we dive into the details. Launching your first product in Europe from a supply chain perspective. The first statement is pretty obvious. An efficient supply chain is fundamental. If you cannot get your product to the patients, if you cannot get your product reimbursed or paid for, then you could say your launch has failed. So extremely important to start in time with looking at the launch of your first product. Building a supply chain is complex. Yeah, we usually say it's not rocket science, otherwise we would not be doing it. But indeed, there are many factors to consider when launching your product in Europe from a supply chain perspective. So we will dive into those details later in the conversation. But yeah, the detail makes it complex. A thorough understanding, we always say, don't jump too quickly to the action mode. But first of all, do a thorough analysis of how your supply chain should look like. What does your patient need? What does your prescriber need? What does your potential reimburser need? Etc. Etc. So take a good look at what the requirements are of your supply chain. Come up with a supply chain strategy, and once that's settled and agreed upon with a larger team, then move into the action mode. So a good analysis, as far as we're concerned, is imperative for the success of a successful rollout. Yes, unfortunately, and we sometimes feel like the fifth wheel on the wagon, unfortunately, some of our clients are starting a little bit late or sometimes too late with preparing with the supply chain. Unfortunately, there are a number of issues and activities that take a long time in preparing for the launch. So it is important to start in time, and we will talk about that timing a little later on in the conversation. So complexities of a European launch. As you see here, there are many things to consider. And usually we talk about the software side and the hardware side, where the software side is very much focused on the product itself. Make sure you have the right product strategy. Make sure you get your product approved. Make sure you have access, you have a reimbursement organized for your product. And last but not least, ensure that the market is ready to adopt your product. So all stuff which we're not going to talk about today, and where our partners and friends of Blue Matter are a lot better in than we are. Hardware on the right-hand side, of course, people is imperative. Good people, experienced people is imperative for a successful rollout of your supply chain. But we're going to look today at infrastructure and specifically at supply chain and finance. So our focus of today will be supply chain, distribution, and finance. So today, a short presentation, which is this one, and I promise you it will not take too long. Then we will have a panel discussion, and I will introduce the panel to you in a minute. And then there's time for questions and answers from the audience. So please feel free to enter your questions on, I think, just heard on the left-hand side of your screen. We will look at those questions. We'll try to address those questions at the end of the session. If we won't have time for it, then we promise to get back to you with a proper answer as soon as we can. So today we're going to talk about key success factors, most common pitfalls and mistakes, the best practices. Again, I mentioned timing before, and we're going to look at timing later on. What can you do in-house and what should you definitely outsource? We're going to take a peek at tax and financial issues, and we're going to take a look at regulatory requirements as well, but not so much the EMA or the MAH approval cycle, but we're going to look at local licenses, or let's say selling licenses or manufacturing licenses, which may be required to operate your European model. On the right-hand side, a little map of Europe, and in the middle you see a little green blob, which is Switzerland. Switzerland not being part of the EU, which implies that there's a separate marketing authorization procedure for Switzerland, and shipping eventually also out of the EU to Switzerland is considered to be a true export. So the necessary precautions need to take place to make that happen. On the left-hand side there, our beloved friends from across the North Sea, not being part of the EU anymore, unfortunately, which also requires a separate marketing authorization procedure, and also a shipment to the UK nowadays is considered to be a true export, and necessary precautions have to be taken both within the EU as well as within the UK to get the supply chain functioning. On top, you see that very big country, Norway. Norway is a kind of a hybrid. They do follow the EMA guidelines and rules and the EMA verdict, but they're not part of the EU, and a shipment to Norway is considered also to be a true export. Then a couple of distribution models. The first one being on the left-hand side, the central model. Quite often located these central warehouses or central 3PLs, third-party logistic service providers, in the vicinity of Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, North, Middle Germany. And out of those locations, you could ship direct your products to throughout Europe. However, there are some restrictions in a number of countries where it is not possible, but I would say in about 80-90% of the cases, you are able to ship out of that one location, with of course a number of limitations connected to that. In the middle, there's the regional model where you can have satellite warehouses or 3PLs in various, let's say, more strategic locations, and out of those locations you can reach your clients in the vicinity of those warehouses. On the right-hand side, the most, let's say, extensive setup, which is the local setup where you would have warehouses in every country where you operate. So today, a number of topics. Let's assume for the sake of the conversation, and also because we only have an hour, that there is a drug substance and the drug product is taken care of. So that product is there. We're going to talk today about secondary packaging, where and how that could be performed in the US, in Europe, or a hybrid of the two. How do you serialize? Because also now in Europe, products need to be serialized, and of course your product needs to be tested. Luckily now the EMA accepts testing outside of the EU, especially the US testing is accepted, however not for ATMP, so it makes it a bit more complicated. So let's assume there is a product, it's packed, it's serialized, it's tested, and then you could say the fun starts. How do you import it into the EU? How do you get it QP released, the qualified person, which is a mandatory requirement in Europe before you can ship products out? From where do you sell? Do you have one entity, or will you have multiple entities who will be selling? And to who do you sell, which is of course a very important consideration for designing your supply chain. Connected to that, of course, how do you invoice? And then we're going to talk about how to organize yourself to get it all happening. And I mentioned already these licenses before, which is an important, let's say, step within preparing your supply chain. Good. Let's meet our panel. Struggling here a little bit. On the left-hand side, it's Christian. Christian is an experienced finance expert who has also carried responsibilities over supply chain at companies like Travere, Santera, Intimune, and Alcon Laboratories. We are delighted that he has been able to join us this afternoon. Joop is one of our senior associates and has a lifelong career in the pharmaceutical industry, both in Europe as well as in the US. He has helped many AIM clients to successfully launch their products in the EU. Welcome, Joop. Then we have Ronald. Ronald is part of the AIM management team and with us now for 4 years. He's held supply chain functions with increasing responsibilities with successful pharma companies. Ronald is and has been supporting many AIM clients. My introduction was already done in the beginning. I'm the managing director of AIM and the co-founder of AIM. Been working in the pharma life science space for all of my life already, always within operations and supply chain roles. And with this, the presentation is concluded and we move over to the questions and answers. All right, Christian, you have been through these adventures a number of times. Can you tell
Yes.
us about the adventure of launching your new company, a new company, and a new product in the EU?
Ooh, it's great fun, but it's rather a marathon than a sprint. And I think important is, and you said it already before, Pim, is to have a good team in place, a multidisciplinary team in place, which can also is able to have different hats, meaning they are not shy to take on responsibilities which are not directly finance or supply chain, because it needs to be a team spirit there. But then it's great fun because you build something from scratch and you really can create a great team spirit. But as you said before, and I would be also my recommendation, start with the core management team 24 months before with hiring, or even 36 months, and get, in case you have really a complex supply chain in plan or even manufacturing in Europe, have also the supply chain expert and tech ops expert with you early.
Thank you very much, Christian. Then we talked about some timing in the, let's say, the previous slides, but Joop, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on the when one should start with the preparations for your EU launch. What would you recommend?
Yeah, I think it's
Um,
important.
sorry.
No, Joop, go ahead.
Yeah, please. Thank you, Pim. Yeah, I think it's important to come back to your remark that we assume here that the CMC part is in place. So drug product and primary packaging has been organized. Then we have two elements in this, and one is the fact that some activities need to happen before submission and some need to be ready before launch. So what we generally state is that you should start at least 24 months before launch, and that is roughly a year before submission. And then the initial critical elements, which are part of your submission, are your packaging side, so the execution of your packaging activities, and the design of your artworks, because the artworks will be part of the submission package. So the packaging elements are an important element, and the other one is what Pim already alluded to, your QP strategy, because you need to include the QP and a QP declaration in your submission. So those are the two time critical elements, and you need uh, at least a year before submission to start with that.
All right. Thanks very much, Joop. So you made me, let's say, anxious and maybe keen to consider moving into Europe. And Christian, how can I enter Europe? What options do you see as let's say an outside company moving into Europe? What options do I have?
Oh, it is a complex and difficult one. First of all, it depends what kind of product you have. You have a mass product, like a basic pharmaceutical product, or you have a rare disease product where you ship maybe only 100 units per day. And then it also depends what the kind of appetite you have in Europe, whether you go full scope, meaning in all member states you want to sell, or you go hybrid, meaning you focus yourself on the top five and the rest you give to a partner, or even what some US pharma companies do. You give everything to a partner, which would be full house license mode, and therefore, and then it depends further what kind of way you have chosen, what kind of product you have, whether you go in a centralized mode, you have one 3PL in Europe, or you go regional approach that you have warehouses in some countries, or you have really, if you really have a mass product, you go really in the local mode that you have in Germany, in France, in the UK, everywhere a warehouse. But then you need to have also a selling entity there. Therefore, it all depends. But lately, because of the capabilities of the 3PLs and the IT developments, I'm a big fan of the centralized mode. You have one 3PL, one selling entity, and you serve the patients. But of course, this is mostly only possible in case you have a product which is rather rare or not such a mass product.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much, Christian. Joop, can you elaborate on that previous point that Christian just explained?
Yeah, I think what
What do you
Chris,
see, what do you think companies do most from your perspective?
yeah, I think what Christian referred to, I think is about risk, and obviously this also strongly relates to when do you get clinical results and when do you have more certainty about your market opportunity and your market size. So you see on the one hand companies that staff early and build an infrastructure uh, already banking on success, and that may be the best model, but there are also companies, and that may be that is very feasible, that you initially do a lot with contractors and a large number of functions, especially in the supply chain, with regards to distribution, with regards to QP capabilities, product safety capabilities. You can outsource it, and then you can choose depending on your phasing. You can choose at some moment to bring certain functions in house. And that even goes outside the supply chain, that you can work with contractors for a long time. So I think it depends on the risk profile of the product and the company.
All right. Thanks. Perfect. Uh, Ronald, maybe not to scare people off, but tell me a few things that can go wrong with setting up the supply chain. Can you hint us to a number of, let's say, risks that you see?
Yeah, I can fill the rest of the time, I think, with the risks that are around, but let me try to focus on four to five. Um, Important is for a supply chain set up to understand, who are your patients and how do they get to the product, or how does the product get to them. So it's important to understand that last mile of the product and the product profile. Will it be dispensed, in a hospital always, or will it start in a hospital and move to a retail pharmacy because it's daily use and the patient is not hospitalized any longer? That kind of question, in combination with product specifics like temperature ranges that you need to take care of, stability information, urgency of supply, of course, too. That's another important one. And it makes a difference whether it's a daily use product or once per 2 weeks injection. And sometimes you need home care service to have patient injection at home. So those kind of considerations are very important to understand the last mile. And it's even complex in Europe because it can be different per country. And there's also a relation to the pricing and reimbursement process. So your product can be classified hospital in one country, but retail in another market. So that is things that the supply chain needs to be flexible in and prepared for to be able to handle. Second one is back to the licenses, and especially now with COVID, we have seen that the committed lead times from the authorities in some countries that give out licenses, like MIAs and WDAs, it's much longer, and a lot of our clients are getting nervous because of that and looking into Plan B, C, and D already, and we have sometimes had to help them also with alternative options, which come with extra work in a time they are extremely busy already because it's typically short before lunch then already when they realize it's getting too late. So the license timelines and starting late and now having to consider more time due to COVID is something people need to be very aware about. Third topic I want to mention is artwork. Artwork is known as the main source for recalls, but setting up first time artwork for European launch is extremely complex. And it depends also whether you launch, one product strength in this market or maybe five strengths. And you have an iteration period with patients to go through where patients switch from one strength to the other in the initiation period. So that kind of complexity and reflecting to artwork, making sure you have your mock-ups for your filing, for your submission ready on time, preparing for commercial artwork, working with your packaging site, integrating serialization and all the local requirements for the blue boxes is an extremely complex piece, and you really need to bring in specialist expertise for that. A fourth topic I want to mention is not having the right local knowledge on board on time, and whether it will be your GM for a particular country or MSLs that are preparing the market. Local intelligence is extremely important. The closer you get to launch, the harder you will need it. When you bring on those people too late, and particularly GMs for countries, it might result in a risk that you have to redesign your supply chain for a part, because often they have their own, thoughts and ideas and best practice and benchmark from other companies that they bring. So that is not always helpful. Sometimes it's very helpful also. I'll leave it at this, Pim, for now.
Thanks very much. Yeah, not to dwell on it too much, Ronald, but you mentioned during your talk about MIA and WDA. I think I know what it means, but can you, in a few words, explain what the one license and what the other license is?
Yes, the MIA is the Manufacturing Importation Authorization. So that is basically your allowance to bring product into Europe under GMP or to manufacture in Europe under GMP. And that is a need, a must. You must have one in Europe, either on your own account or via a business partner. It's also possible. The WDA is the Wholesaler Dealer Authorization, which is the distribution license, allowing you to sell the product into a certain market or Europe as a whole. And WDAs have different names in different countries in Europe. Like in France, it's called the Exploitant license. And you need in generally one for Europe, but there are countries that require an additional local one too.
Okay, let's not make it too complicated for now, but at least it's an importation license, you could say, and a selling license.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Ronald. Okay, so I think you managed to scare us pretty well so far. But Joe, maybe on the more positive side, could you say what the key success factors are when wanting to launch in Europe from a supply chain perspective? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I think you have to start the critical elements early, and they were mentioned, like the packaging. Ronald referred to the artwork. The licenses nowadays is a critical element, but you also have to be flexible, and that means that you make plans, but results may change. Market access timelines may change, so that is where you need to be able to shift plans. And I think what is important that for key roles that you have for the key roles you have the local knowledge in place, partly internal or through a consultant. You need to be able to relate to the local marketplace.
Perfect. Okay. Good. I think, Christian, I've made up my mind. I think I want to go to Europe. Who helps me entering Europe? What's your experience with that regard? What kind of assistance is available, and how would you recommend going around it?
Look, I think my learning is get a first class partner on your side. You pay double. If you are cheap at the beginning, you pay double. Therefore, get a first class partner on your side, and ideally get for each of the topic one partner on your side. For example, supply chain, distribution, manufacturing, AIM. For finance, maybe one of the big fours, that you really have an interface, always a one-to-one relationship. Because otherwise, if you have too many cooks preparing the meal, you get problems at later stage. Therefore, this is my really biggest advice I can give. From the beginning, first class partner, and really try to get a one-to-one relationship for each of the functions.
Okay, thanks very much, Christian. And okay, Ronald, when wanting to set up your supply chain in Europe, what kind of expertise do you think you need next to, let's say, your supply chain expertise in order to be successful in setting it up?
Yeah, I would say, Pim, that in really, our projects, we collaborate a lot with initial phase and the strategy phase, more with the tech side of the house, finance and tax. It's very much about, what is the selling model that will be chosen, what are implications for organization, and so on. Then running into more the regulatory area, which comes into play with the artwork mockups preparation typically. And there, of course, there's a strong interface with quality and supply chain always for topics as serialization, but also the supply chain wants to be, optimizing, like the SKU design, country combinations, for instance, is something that supply chain will be looking for. But regulator has to believe it also and has to submit it to the authorities. So that's an important interface. Quality is really a partner in crime all the time throughout the whole lifespan of a project, I would say, because GDP is all over the place. In all we do, partner selections, implementation, transport validation, a lot of topics where we really collaborate with QA folks. And not to forget about quality agreements that you need later on. Accounting, finance is more close to launch when you set up for order to cash with probably a chosen 3PL partner. You need to design the documentation for writing invoices and stuff like that. So that's where more accounting is often involved. I think that's the major 3, 4, 5 areas that I see interacting a lot with supply chain people in an European launch and building really
Yeah.
the operational picture.
And if I may add to that, Ronald, I think you have to distinguish that for some functions, it is fine to work with let's say, a generic European consultancy partner. For example, most regulatory processes nowadays is a centralized procedure. But if you talk about a pharmaceutical license, really the local knowledge and the local connections are very important. So depending on the function, it may be one pan-European partner, or you will probably be better off to work with a partner with local expertise. That's at least our experience.
I agree. Thanks for that addition, Joop. I fully agree. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, guys. So we know what kind of expertise is required to get it to make it happen. Christian, from your perspective, when should you start considering hiring these people, and how would you go about doing that, getting that expertise on board?
Look, this is a difficult one because Joop said it already. Some companies are rather brave and they know we have good data and they hire early. Some companies are rather careful. It all depends a bit on the cash flow situation of each company and the risk appetite. But my learning is a bit, ideally, you hire the key management team 3 years before, 36 months before launch. You always count backwards from the launch, but also maybe 24 months would be okay. But then you really need to hire the key European functions like the GM, the medic, the marketeers, maybe the marketeers a bit later, but the finance guy, and especially it depends what you plan in Europe. Just distribution, but also manufacturing. The supply chain tech ops guy should be also early on board. And then, as we said, it depends on the launch. Normally, you launch first Germany. You really need to look at your market access strategy, and then you decide on the countries. And my learning is hire the country GM 12 months before launch, or 15 months, but 12 months is still okay. Then 9 months later, 3 months later, the medic, and then 6 months later, the marketeer and the key account managers. But it all depends a bit on the risk appetite, as we said. But as Joop said, and also Ronald, I think, said it, local knowledge is key, especially the GM, because these GMs normally have then more heads on their shoulders. For example, they are then a bit also the first local market access experience guy, and therefore you need those people to define your supply chain.
Right. Thanks. I like that. More heads on their shoulders. So we need people with a couple of heads.
Yeah.
Great. Ronald, so I think I'm convinced I've got everything in place. What would be your recommended approach towards creating the supply chain infrastructure? How would you go about it? You mentioned already something about the last mile, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit further on how you would go around, preparing yourselves for that European launch.
Yeah, now first you need to ensure yourself that all on the filing process is running, so to say, and that the EMA filing is given out with a time plan around, when is expected approval or positive opinion due. Um, your secondary packaging site needs to be selected, and there must be a project ongoing to prepare them. Um, and then any other additional license like MIAs and so on need to be started. Um,
Hmm.
then we would, in that phase, start or recommend to start with the last mile study, as you call it. So we really would do for selective countries a deep dive on the last mile process in a country, because in the end, as I explained in the beginning of this call, uh, this has a strong implication for how to set up your supply chain, and we can do that through interviews with healthcare professionals who really understand, how do they prescribe, how do they organize fulfillment, do they keep stock, where do they send you, what is the monitoring process around the patient, and so how often will the patient go back to a hospital, for instance, to the specialist or not, and work with the GP further on, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of detail that's coming out of such studies that is extremely helpful to use as input for your supply chain design. Now, based on those findings, you can then start the supply chain design. We typically look at, financial flows, product flows, and title flows. Those three elements mainly, and trying to, picture that, validate that with the client to see, okay, is this the model that we need to get prepared for? Then in the next step, we suggest to select partners for them. For instance, a 3PL partner. It can be also wholesalers in particular countries where they might want to go wholesaler model. And we would then organize, based around the specification, set up an RFP process, RFQ process, run a selection round, and then help the client with the selection itself, the business analysis, and the qualification and contracting of such partners. And then you would move into an implementation phase, which typically takes for more the distribution piece, like 6 months at minimum, I would say, rather than 9 months ahead of the due date for launch, the best date that the client expects, so the most aggressive date, so to say. Because it's always better to have a little bit of time left than getting short. That is overall the process. So a 4 or 5 step process we can follow to prepare for daily operations for supply chain distribution in Europe.
All right, thanks very much, Ronald. Christian, anything to add to this as far as you're concerned with regard to the preparation for, the
Look,
layout
I
of
think
the
that,
all the efforts?
yeah, thanks, Tim. I think there are two elements. First of all, is a regular follow-up with clear responsibilities. You can do it with the RACI model, flow charts that you really define, and don't be shy to also name responsibilities and tell and deadlines, because it's a complex project. And if you don't do a regular follow-up and you create a team spirit within your implementation team, then you can easily fail or at least delay a bit. Therefore, clear process, strict follow-up, responsibilities. Then I think you get there. On the side, what Ronald said, you really need to nail down your product flow. You need to be aware what is the physical flow, what is the financial flow, where do titles change, and then have it please validated by financial and tax experts, because each company is different, and maybe you can benefit from a tax deal in a country, or you can benefit from the net operating losses somewhere in a country. Therefore, you need to really think here, and you need to have time. Also, where do you set up the selling entity? It also depends then where you apply for the wholesaler dealer license or the MIA. Therefore, this needs to be really nailed down, flowchart, discussed with experts, and it takes time. And then as a next step, as Ronald also said, and it depends where do you sit, where you need to register for VAT registration, where do you need to register for all the other licenses. Therefore, this is the starting point. Draw down your product flow.
All right, excellent.
Yeah, and I think maybe one more thought on this. Often you see that companies, let's say a general rule is that a EU launch follows 1 quarter after a US launch. what it often means, and this is quite logical if you're a US-based company, that there's a lot of focus on the US. And then what we often see is that EU activities get second priority. So if you want to be successful in Europe, make sure you have at least some people dedicated that work on Europe and that have sufficient time available and can make decisions to progress Europe in parallel with the US. That is clearly a challenge for many companies.
Okay. Yeah, it's good add-on. Thanks very much, Joop, for that. So maybe we could go down the supply chain now somewhat, and we go step by step, and we see how we should tackle the various challenges within that supply chain. If we start with the packaging and artwork discussion, which already came up during a number of items. A question which often comes up, maybe Ronald, should I do secondary packaging in the EU or elsewhere, like most obvious in the US, or is there a hybrid possible as well? Can you shine your light on that ever coming back question?
Yeah, it's indeed an ever coming back question. We deal with it regularly. My first advice would also always be to start to do it in Europe for Europe because of the complexities of Europe. But there might be reasons that still clients prefer to start off from the US and later on bring in a second packaging site in Europe. If volumes are extremely small, or for instance, time is extremely short to prepare or select and prepare a packaging site in Europe, it might be sacrificed at cases. Still, I think the majority of our clients choose us for a European packaging site for the obvious reasons of being able to handle the complexity, but also have somehow more flexibility, and also not having to share the capacity with their US colleagues. Because the last thing you want is that your Europeans and American colleagues fight for capacity of a single CPO packaging site. But as said, it's a hybrid as well possible. But yeah, it's important then that if you have two sides, of course, you have also fallback options, but only if you then include both sides in your dossier, of course.
Yeah.
So that is an additional value of two sides.
Okay, all right. Hey, whilst we're on the topic, Europe has all these languages. Do you need a separate SKU for every country, or are there smart ideas or smart combinations possible?
Yeah, so generally speaking, you can combine languages as long as the asset, the space on the package allows it. With serialization, we have basically had to do a step back because serialization takes space. But still, country combinations are possible. In practice, we see mostly 2 or 3 language, 2 or 3 countries being combined on a single pack. We see hardly more than 3, I would say. And there are countries where simply you can only go with a single SKU, like for instance Italy, because they have a different system for serialization still in Europe till 25.
Okay, all right, good.
Yeah, and I think we can be, because it's one of the questions in the panel I see. Maybe let's go a little bit in a bit more detail. Like Ronald said, it's a matter of space of languages. Then there is local requirements. People may be aware that each country still has a so-called blue box where they can specify local requirements. And then it has become a bit more complicated with the serialization that is now mandatory in Europe. And that also complicates combining some packs. So like practical combinations, the Nordics is a very common combination. Germany, Austria is a common combination. Combining France is complicated because of the serialization. UK nowadays, which after Brexit is usually a separate pack because they stepped out of the European serialization initiatives. So there are a number of logical combinations that many companies apply, and obviously there are also sometimes commercial considerations to combine certain countries or not.
Okay. So I have found a packaging company in Europe, as suggested by Ronald. And I also asked these guys to do European distribution. That would be so handy if I have that in one hand.
Yeah, but I think really there are still a few companies that claim to do distribution and packaging, but really those are different capabilities. And packaging has become very specialized, especially now with the serialization being in place. But in Europe, the role of the distributor is to allocate often multi-country packs across different markets. But it's not just the physical distribution with all the complicated requirements with regards to transport compliance and transport capabilities, but also in Europe, almost all the companies outsource their order to cash activities. So the customer facing activities are performed by a third party logistics provider. And that really is a very specialized capability. So I think in practice, it is not working, and it is hardly used anymore to use a packaging partner and a third party logistics distributor with the same company.
In one. Okay. All right. Okay. Good, good, good. Um, then, I understand I need a 3PL and a third-party logistics service provider in Europe. I'm familiar with the parties in the US. Ronald, could you compare the US 3PLs with what the European 3PLs can provide? And can you maybe leverage the work that you do in the US, maybe already partly towards the Europe as well?
No, that's a long shot. We know that European 3PLs, we have three different tiers basically. We have the ones that claim to be able to serve whole of Europe out of one place, pan-European. We have a second tier that offers more regional models or local models, and we have a third tier which is more localized players or local players, no international players.
Mhm.
The US, the big three, let's say ICS, McKesson, and so on, they are, I think, more advanced on the IT side, reporting, drop shipment kind of approaches than the Europeans. You could, as Europeans, we say sometimes Europe is more complex than the US is, but of course, distance is also something in the US. But I think they play more on the strength of the order to cash piece next to proper warehousing, distribution, transportation. While in Europe, the focus is much more on the warehousing and distribution than order to cash for most of the players, I would say.
Mhm.
So I cannot really compare, and we know McKesson has tried to buy business in Europe, but they pulled back already after a couple of years. We have seen Owens and Minor trying to get ground in Europe; they also turned back. So I don't see any company at this stage that is successful in both parts of the world.
Okay. All right. Joop,
No,
anything to add from Joop?
in the US, the 3PLs that Ronald mentioned often take title before selling, so they take away all that order to cash complexity, which is what European 3PLs typically not do. They will do the order to cash, the invoicing, but on behalf of the principal. In the US, the 3PLs manage a lot of the payer complexity, which is less the case and less relevant in Europe. On the other hand, in Europe, you have the language requirements with regards to customer service. You have the transport complexity. You have the different currencies, the different VAT rates. So these are the typical differences that where the EU complexity is different from the US one.
Okay. Okay. Okay, good. So I'm going about selecting a European 3PL, and maybe Ronald, you can hold me by the hand and tell me what your recommended approach would be in selecting a 3PL. First of all, maybe a European 3PL.
Yeah, of course, you start off with describing the scope of services that the client needs. I mean, we will give an advice, the client will fine tune that with us. Say, I want to do certain things maybe in-house, some things they really want to outsource. So then you get to call it a specification, and we run the RFP. And typically with 3 to 5 companies, depending a bit on the scope and the time we have also with a client, because we have sometimes to do accelerated processes too. Then typically, out of the initial analysis, you typically end up with top 2, and sometimes they are close, sometimes they are less close. But then it's a good moment to also do a little roadshow and just visit the sites. Supply chain need to see a place where your client is going to store the goods, and the client also needs to see it. That's very important to look in the eyes of the provider, to try to get to a connection or to find out whether there can be a connection even, and build that trust from that first day onwards is very important, because you give your whole business into the hands of the 3PL typically in Europe, especially the startups do that often. So that is important, the site visits, and that was difficult with COVID, of course, but luckily we can do it again. And then out of that, process, ultimately, after the analysis, financial analysis, qualitative analysis, there's a preferred candidate, and we typically use a rating kind of criterion, weighting chart to rate the candidates together with the client, and make sure all the functions representative functions are there: quality, finance, supply chain, business also. So at least those 4 functions we bring into that decision-making unit, if you want. Yeah, and then there's a preferred candidate, and then the normal process starts off: letter of intent, statement of work, and then the final negotiations on the terms and conditions and the details, of course, before you start the implementation. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Ronald. So quite a lot of work I hear, if I hear you well. So I think it's now time to move over to the questions of the audience. And very happy to do that, of course. One of the questions which came in is about this QP release, how that should be organized. And maybe, Joop, you can take us through that process and how you assign your QP and what the remit of QP is.
Yeah. Well, and this is the QP is a EU specific role which does not have an analog in the US, but the QP is releasing the product to the market and is personally accountable to the quality for the quality of the product. And that starts with that before the submission, the QP already provides a QP declaration which guarantees the GMP compliance of the active substance used in the drug product. So that is an activity for which the QP is responsible already before submission. Then before releasing actual product to the market, the QP is basically has to audit and has to qualify the complete supply chain up until secondary packaging. So all the steps in the supply chain have to be qualified by the QP, and the QP will not release product to the market as long as that has not been guaranteed. And then the QP needs to release each batch. So there will be cooperation from an EU QP with, for example, a US-based quality team, but ultimately the QP has an independent decision to make and is fully accountable, and, for example, also has a very independent responsibility in case a recall is needed. So that is something that sometimes US companies need to get used to, that this is a strong formal role. How you can organize that is, well, basically there are 2 flavors, and I think Ronald already mentioned it. You can either set up your own manufacturing license, and then you can still choose to employ your own QP, or you can work with a contract QP, but then the release will be done in your own name, so your own entity has its license. But that means that you have to have that MIA license, which requires building a quality management system and applying for a license and getting an approval, which is quite a lengthy process. The alternative, which many small companies use, at least initially, is that you work with a partner, and that could be your packaging partner or a specialized partner that has the license, and then that company is basically your releasing party, and they will be mentioned in your product information, in your product insert as the manufacturer. So they will be responsible for the release of your product. So those are the two main flavors. And let's say many small companies choose for the outsource model and move to the an internal QP or an internal MIA when they get more volume. But that obviously depends also on product company strategy and risk profile.
Perfect. I thought it was a small question, but it is quite a broad topic. I understand.
Well, it's even more complicated because if you have your own manufacturing license, you don't need a separate distribution license. So there is more to it than that, but that maybe goes too far to go into all the details. And then and then I'll stop. There are differences in regulations across countries. So this is not to scare people off, but even though the EU rules, there is one set of EU rules, the interpretation is different across the various countries.
Okay. And maybe a question for you, Christian, with regard to this 3PL. We hear it can be in the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, maybe other options. Does that have any tax implications where your 3PL will be located?
Yes, indeed. And I think it goes back to an earlier question we had is you need to be sure on your product flow, the physical flow, the money flow, and the titleship ownership. And then you need to really work with your partners on the regulatory license needs and on the financial license needs, because you can have a MIA, you can have a wholesale dealer license, but you need to have then also VAT registrations, especially in the country where you have the physical products sitting. And then some countries even have a VAT deferment, because when you import products, normally you need to pay money upfront, import VAT, and then after 3 months you get it back. In some companies, it's really they are short on cash flow. Therefore, for them, it's already a burden. And some countries even allow that you do not need to pay and get it back in 3 months' time. Therefore, you need to really be sure where your product is going, your flow, and then you need to sit with your partners and determine which registrations you need. And please do it in time, because as Ronald said, now even with COVID, it takes longer. And it takes time to apply for this license. And what Job said to this earlier point, the more licenses you have inside, the more you are faced with audits. And you need to have there also resources to be with these audits, especially on the regulatory side of life. And Job and Ronald for sure know this. They come in and they check you, and it can be painful.
Okay, thanks very much. The next question is interesting, but the risk of getting very detailed. Maybe Rod, you can help me with this one. There's a question coming in whether if you do centralized distribution, whether you can get away with having and you have, of course, you have to serialize your product. Do you still need to register that then with the local serialization bodies, the NMVOs, if you only do, let's say, central distribution? Is that still a necessity?
Yeah, every country in Europe where you put your product on the market, you have to contact with the National Medicines Verification Organization, NMVO. Though some of the countries in Europe allow a almost for free ride. So there are some countries that offer facilities for one product companies where the onboarding fees are waived. But in general, yes, you have to contract in every member state where you launch separately the NMVO. Yes.
No. I guess maybe one addition, the one exception is if you have an ATMP, a cell therapy product, those are excluded from serialization. But that's, I would say, a rare case. But that is one of the differences for ATMP, for cell therapy products.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, whilst we're on the topic of cell therapy, Joop, you started yourself. How would you tackle the design and implementation of an ATMP product, which can be, I understand, very, very different from a regular biotech product?
Yeah, I think, well, some ATMPs are not that different. Some of the gene therapies are fairly similar to let's say standard traditional bioproducts, but especially cell therapy products can be very specific with regards to storage and processing temperatures. With regards to turnaround time, especially if it's personalized medicine like autologous cell therapy products. So there you have to do with lead times, and then also a specific example or a specific challenge is then the chain of custody, which you need to guarantee for these products. And I think why you need to start early with ATMPs is because it's very much a field that is evolving, and the EMA is finding out at the moment how they want to deal with it. So it's more almost a conversation with the authorities how you organize it than that the regulation is clear. So I think especially for ATMPs, the recommendation is start early.
Okay, good. Yeah, maybe in a kind of a summary, Joop, what would you believe are the most common mistakes when entering the EU? I think we addressed a few, and you just hinted to the ATMP side as well. But maybe in kind of conclusion, you can summarize what the let's say common mistakes are.
Yeah, I think like we said, have to have the basics in place in time.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure you have a focused team that is has priority for the EU, and like also Christian said, for a number of elements, especially if you get closer to launch, make sure you have local expertise in-house and have people in Europe that know the European landscape and know the differences between the countries. I think that is key. You can initially do quite a bit from the US, but when you get closer to launch, you need local expertise in the various functions. So those
All
for
right,
me
thank
are
you.
the key elements.
Okay, Christian. I mean, I'm in the middle of doing all this stuff. What would you recommend from a let's say team perspective? How would you go about getting the team together and keeping the team happy?
I think this is sometimes a bit underestimated at this point. You need to create a team spirit. And normally at the beginning, you have a small team and you need to rely heavily on third-party help like AI, AIM, or PricewaterhouseCoopers, etc. You need to really create a team. You need to go there. As also Ronald said, and Joop, also for the 3PL, go there on site, have a look, have a lunch with them, have a dinner with them, really create a team. Also celebrate success, celebrate milestones, because then every team member goes the extra mile and then you're successful. But if you don't create this and if you don't celebrate success, then normally people go in a reactive mode, then a proactive mode, and then you are under risk. Therefore, you really need to try, because it's also fun. When you're on the road, you visit a 3PL, you visit a packaging site, you meet people there. Don't just be there for 1 hour. Maybe spend another hour and go for lunch, because this then creates a kind of team spirit, and it's then also great fun.
All right. I think, as far as I'm concerned, and we are concerned, this will conclude the webinar. I would like to thank the panelists very, very much for their insightful information. Very much appreciated, guys. I've learned a lot more. Again, attendees, we will respond separately to your questions if they have not been answered during this call. Thanks again for everyone being there. And if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to AIM. We're here to help. Right, then hand it over to Michael.
Thanks, Pim, and thank you for attending this Fierce Biotech webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating and AIM for presenting today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded. You'll be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.